Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the nature of wars of occupation with the author of Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam, Nick Turse.
This came down from the highest levels that you had to produce bodies. But troops in the field realized very quickly that it didn't really matter what bodies. As long as they were Vietnamese, any body would do.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Occupation forces, when they battle an insurgency, as in Iraq, Afghanistan, Gaza, or Vietnam, are placed in atrocity-producing situations. Being surrounded by a hostile population makes simple acts, such as going to a store to buy a can of Coke, dangerous. The fear and stress pushes troops to view everyone around them as the enemy. The hostility is compounded when the enemy, as in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam, is elusive and shadowy. The rage soldiers and Marines feel after a roadside bomb or mine explodes, killing or maiming their comrades, is one that is easily directed to innocent civilians who are seen to support the insurgents. Civilians and combatants, in the eyes of beleaguered troops, merge into one entity. These civilians, who rarely interact with soldiers or Marines, are to most of the occupation troops nameless, faceless, and easily turned into abstractions of hate. They are dismissed as less than human. It is a short psychological leap, but a massive moral leap. It is a leap from killing, the shooting of someone who has the capacity to do you harm, to murder, the deadly assault against someone who cannot harm you. Our wars of occupation are primarily about murder. RT correspondent Anya Parampel looks at the civilian cost that accompanied our defeat in Vietnam.
The war in Vietnam is known as America's longest military conflict. While the U.S. provided support to the French colonial administration of the nation for several years, President Eisenhower sent the first U.S. military advisors to the country in 1955, with the goal of training South Vietnamese forces to fight against the Soviet-backed Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters. The last U.S. personnel would not leave until nearly 20 years later, in 1974. And while the U.S. has moved on into a state of nearly permanent warfare since, the impact of the war on Vietnam and its people is nearly impossible to quantify. 2 million. That's how many Vietnamese were killed in the war, according to government numbers released in 1995. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh uncovered one of the most infamous and vicious incidents. On March 16, 1968, U.S. soldiers slaughtered nearly the entire population of a hamlet in the My Lai village of southern Vietnam. Women were gang raped, and men, women, and children, even infants, were massacred. In total, 26 soldiers killed up to 504 unarmed civilians. No one ever went to prison for the rampage. Historians like Nick Turse report bloody episodes like the My Lai massacre were common practice for the U.S. military. But the U.S. didn't just pillage Vietnam. It also poisoned the country for decades to come through its scorched earth policy dubbed Operation Ranch Hand, during which U.S. aircraft dropped at least 19 million gallons of toxic pesticide created by Monsanto, called Agent Orange, over Vietnamese land. The Vietnamese government estimates 400,000 people were killed or maimed by Operation Ranch Hand. Additionally, it claims 500,000 babies have been born with serious birth defects in years since, and as many as 2 million people developed cancer and other illnesses due to exposure to Agent Orange. American service members tasked with executing the operation adopted the motto, "Only you can prevent a forest." Perhaps once you comprehend the human price paid by the Vietnamese people, it's no surprise what we know as the Vietnam War is known to the Vietnamese as the resistance war against America.
Thank you, Anya. Nick Turse is an investigative journalist and author. His latest book is Next Time They'll Come to Count the Dead, War and Survival in South Sudan. Turse's New York Times bestseller, Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam, is not only one of the most important books ever written about the Vietnam conflict, but provides readers with an unflinching account of the nature of modern industrial warfare, what the sociologist James William Gibson calls techno-war. It captures the reality of war, a reality that is shrouded in censorship and propaganda while the war takes place and only comes out years, sometimes decades later. For this reason, we need to look closely at what we did in Vietnam to understand what we are doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for having me on.
This is a remarkable book, one you spent 12 years writing. It shows it. And what is so powerful about it is much, if not most, of the documentation comes from the Army itself. And perhaps you can just begin by telling us how that process took place.
Sure. You know, it was happenstance that I found these documents. I was a graduate student at the time. I was working on a project on post-traumatic stress disorder among Vietnam veterans. And I was down at the National Archives on a research trip. I spent about 2 weeks down there, and every research avenue that I pursued was a dead end. It was just, you know, one brick wall after another. And finally, I threw myself on the mercy of an archivist there. I told him that I couldn't go back to my boss empty-handed. I needed something, at least a lead. And he ended up asking me a question that changed my life. He asked me if I thought that witnessing war crimes could cause post-traumatic stress. I told him that I thought it was an excellent hypothesis, and I said, what do you have on war crimes? And he told me about a collection of files called the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group Collection. I came to understand later that this was a secret task force set up in the Pentagon, in the Army Chief of Staff's office. At the time, that was General William Westmoreland, who just a couple years before had been the supreme U.S. commander in Vietnam. And this task force was set up in the wake of the My Lai massacre. In 1968, American troops slaughtered 500 Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. There was a cover-up, and it only came out about a year and a half later.
Led by Major Colin Powell.
Indeed, integral to it. And it was exposed by Seymour Hersh. Because of that, it was a PR disaster for the military, and a decree came down from the White House that said, we're never going to be caught flat-footed again by an atrocity scandal. And this is why the task force was set up. They spent several years amassing what I found was 30 archival boxes filled with reports of massacres, murder, rape, torture, assault, mutilation, horrific crimes committed by U.S. GIs, but also reported by active duty GIs and recently returned Vietnam veterans, and investigated by the Army's own criminal investigators.
Who did almost nothing.
Right. I mean, in some cases they did very thorough investigations.
Well, no, I meant in terms of repercussions.
In repercussions, absolutely. Almost none of these cases were ever brought to a court-martial, and even the few that were, at best, there was a slap on the wrist for the individuals involved, but most of the time they closed the cases and just buried them away.
And then you just burrowed into these records.
I did.
And I think you also went and tracked down, was it roughly 100 veterans who had been eyewitnesses?
Yeah, hundreds of veterans, you know, over the years. I traveled the country, finding witnesses and perpetrators, interviewing them, and eventually went to Vietnam over several years.
I think the book's extremely important because it exposes the pattern of foreign occupation, and I've covered different types of wars. I covered the insurgencies in Central America. Those are civil wars. I covered the first Gulf War, which was largely mechanized units clashing in desert where there were very few civilians when we went into Kuwait. But foreign occupations are dirty. They are what Robert J. Lifton calls atrocity-producing situations. And that's why this book is so important in terms of our understanding what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. That Vietnam, like Iraq and Afghanistan, is one long atrocity because everybody is seen as the enemy. And you document that very well. You also document what has always been part of the American military dogma, and that's what overkill. And perhaps you can talk about that dogma.
Sure. I mean, this gets back to something you mentioned early on, this techno-war concept. You know, the United States brought to bear a tremendous amount of destructive power, killing force on, you know, what was a third world agrarian society.
640 Hiroshimas in terms of tonnage of bombs, right?
Right. I mean, more explosives were expended in Southeast Asia, more munitions than were dropped by all sides during World War II. Most of it on South Vietnam, which was our ally in the war. during the war, a lot of people feared North Vietnam was going to be the most bombed country in history, but it turned out to be our allies in the South. And this was directed on rural population living in, basically in thatch and bamboo houses. And these people were just bombed and shelled relentlessly and eventually ended up living semi-subterranean existence in bomb shelters, trying to eke out an existence as the United States poured just a tremendous amount of artillery fire, bombs,
and also,
napalm.
you point out 70 million tons of herbicidal agents and 3 million white phosphorus rockets.
Yes, it was, just such a tremendous amount of destructive force. I've always, I'm reminded of the graphic novel, The Watchmen, which was eventually turned into a movie. And in that alternate universe, a nuclear-powered superhero named Dr. Manhattan is unleashed on Vietnam and brings Vietnam to its knees. But what the United States actually brought there was otherworldly. I mean, just a huge percentage of the American military, the fighting forces that were available at the time, the bombers, B-52 bombers, the amount of fighter bomber jets that were deployed there. It was a tremendous percentage of this country's military capacity, all directed at a very tiny agrarian country.
Which is true in Iraq is not necessarily an agrarian country. Afghanistan is. 70% of Afghanis live outside of urban centers. But that same kind of techno-war, even more advanced, of course, has been, but we didn't see those patterns during the Vietnam conflict. And they were very carefully hidden after the conflict until I think you uncovered them. And now they've sealed the files again. I mean, you can't get into these records. Is that correct?
Right. They were pulled from the archives shelves sometime after I first started. I published my first article on these records. And, to my knowledge, and I haven't been back there in a few years, but they were taken from the shelves, and now you had to file a Freedom of Information Act request for each and every file folder. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of files. There also is no box list for these files, no list of the file folders, so it's a classic catch-22.
Right.
How can you file a FOIA request for them if you don't know what those files are?
Well, I think what most people who haven't been in the midst of conflicts or done this kind of research you have don't understand is that a first lieutenant, coming in from, for instance, Kuwait on the way to Baghdad can see some kind of suspicious movement in a village and call in airstrikes, whereas in a matter of minutes that village no longer exists. That was very much part of the Vietnam conflict and is very much part of the conflict today in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, this was a hallmark of the Vietnam War where they'd use preparatory artillery in places that were considered free fire zones.
So a free fire zone means everything and everyone is a target.
Exactly. That this entire area, everyone in is considered the enemy, and you have license to blanket it with heavy firepower. And these places were considered strongholds of the revolution, but this was also where most of the population lived. And these were the people that endured this horrendous firepower.
Great. And we'll be back in a moment to speak with Nick Turse, author of Kill Everything That Moves. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation with investigative journalist Nick Turse, author of Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam. We'd been speaking about the power of techno-war, which of course has become even more deadly, even more sophisticated in the 15 years of warfare in the Middle East. But there is also in these foreign occupations an inclination on the part of the occupying force towards acts of sadism, public abuse, dehumanization, gang rape, torture, savage beatings, and that's very much a part of your book. The behavior on the part of occupying American forces that can kill with impunity, we got a glimpse of that through, for instance, the WikiLeaks video of the helicopter firing on unarmed civilians. And That is a very important part of your book, and the incidents that you describe are quite graphic and quite disturbing. You write about a wounded detainee who's dumped in a boat, pushed into a rice paddy, riddled with bullets, finished off with a grenade, a wounded woman covered with a straw mat, set on fire. You quote Paul Halverson, a soldier and military combat correspondent who had accompanied that unit, when he was asked about the total number of civilians killed. This was by a commander named Lanning. He said, "The entire time I was there, just by Charlie Company, I would say it was in the hundreds."
And this wasn't atypical in many respects. There were, what was atypical was to have a whistleblower like Lanning or some of the others that I talk about in the book, or Halverson. But you know, these extreme body counts built up by individual units, and a lot of this sadism, I think, was rooted in racism.
Yeah. Well, that's also true in the Middle East.
Sure. In Vietnam, there was a shorthand that they called the MGR, or the Mir Gook rule. This slur was, Gook was common currency there. That the Vietnamese weren't seen as real people. They were just seen as...
Like Haji or Raghead.
Or Raghead, yes.
Or sand niggers or...
Right. You know, and this is, I mean, this has been a hallmark of American warfare, to dehumanize the enemy, make them easier to kill. And I talked to veterans who told me, especially minority veterans, who said that during basic training, they heard all these slurs, and they realized that it was the same type of thing they'd experienced at home. I remember one medic telling me that he understood. He said he vowed never to use the word gook, but he said, you know, I heard it over and over again through basic training, through when he went to advanced infantry training when he got to Vietnam, in his unit every day. And finally, he said he just started using it. He realized that it was so powerful, it just overcame him, and even his vow and his understanding that it was the same type of dehumanization that he faced as a black man in the United States.
Well, there's a kind of sick enjoyment that comes. You talk in the book about helicopters going up and essentially just hunting, firing on unarmed peoples in rice paddies. Yes,
this was, you know, a lot of times they would buzz Vietnamese who were out working in the paddies because they had a mandate. If they ran, they were Viet Cong, VC, the enemy. So they would hover over people to make them afraid. They would use a siren on the helicopter or make the helicopter dive towards the people. And it takes, I mean, extreme fortitude when a Huey gunship or you know, an Apache helicopter dives at you. You're going to run, or if they fire near you, you're going to try and get out of there. And that makes you a target. Of course, almost anything in Vietnam made Vietnamese a target.
Torture. Torture was an integral part of the Vietnam conflict, as it has been in Iraq. We saw a glimpse of that in Abu Ghraib. Perhaps you can talk about how that took place.
Sure. You know, when the Abu Ghraib revelations came about, it all sounded extremely familiar to me. There's a number of investigations in the files I found, but one that stood out was a military intelligence unit where they detailed more than 100 separate instances of torture, probably many more than that. It was routine in the unit. Beatings, electrical torture. They would use what were in Vietnam field telephones, where you'd crank it up and create electric shock. They'd use the wires, place them on you know, the fingers, face, genitals, and use this to shock prisoners or detainees. Oftentimes, these were just, again, average civilians who the military picked up, beat, then brought in for interrogations, and then used even more extreme versions of torture, including water torture, what we know as waterboarding today. This, of course, is a type of torture that's been employed by the United States over the years, back to at least the Philippines insurrection at the turn of the 20th century. But this was commonly used in Vietnam and widely by units in the field and then military intelligence units in the rear.
You blame the military hierarchy for this. You say that this was a very conscious decision on the part of the hierarchy. While they were speaking one way to the American public, they were speaking in a very different way to combat troops.
Yeah, I think this is definitely command policy. You know, the military has always used this idea that bad apples or rogue elements commit atrocities, but in Vietnam, it was definitely coming from the top down, that these were policies that were implemented at the Pentagon and then sent down the chain of command.
Which we saw in Iraq with Petraeus, essentially sending Colonel Steele, who had been the military group advisor when I was covering the war in El Salvador, to oversee Shiite death squads that were killing Sunnis.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just a rogue unit or a lieutenant who's gotten out of control. The entire Vietnam War was really premised on the idea of body count. That's how the metric that was used to tell if you were winning. But this came down from the highest levels that you had to produce bodies. But troops in the field realized very quickly that it didn't really matter what bodies. As long as they were Vietnamese, anybody would do. The common phrase at the time was, if it's dead in Vietnamese, it's VC. The Viet Cong.
Well, you talk about one psychopath. I think he did 7 tours in Vietnam.
Yes, Sergeant Baumgartner, who, he was, I think, someone who was a pathological killer who found his calling in Vietnam. For years, men under his command had reported that they were killing civilians, and he was just planting weapons on them. And commanders looked the other way for a long time. Finally, too much evidence was gathered, and Baumgartner was court-martialed. Now, you would expect that, at a court-martial where it was proven that he had killed 3 innocent Vietnamese with no weapons on them, planted weapons.
He killed far more than 3, of course.
Far more than 3 over the course of his tour. He had an individual body count that topped 1,000. But in this particular instance, it was a boy and 2 men who were rounded up, gunned down, and a grenade was exploded.
They were just summary executions.
Yeah, in cold blood. They were tied up and executed. And this all came out at court-martial. But Baumgartner was never even kicked out of the military. He was knocked down in rank, reduced in pay. He requested service in Vietnam to continue, and he continued on in Vietnam for years.
See, that's an important point, because I've been with many military units, and most of them are not psychopaths. It's only 1 or 2%. But within the military culture, nothing is ever done to restrain the psychopath. So if you're going through a mud-walled village and they decide to open up with a 7.62 machine gun on mud and wattle huts, nobody will stop them, and nobody will report them, and ultimately nobody will punish them. And I think that's what your book captures.
Yeah, there was a real culture of silence around men like Sergeant Roy Baumgartner, and then writ large across the military.
I think one of the things your book does very well for me is grasp that the culture of the military is at its core a culture of sadism and a culture of death. And I don't think anyone can finish reading your book and not grasp that what you have described is finally not just a pattern of behavior, but the very kind of ideological engine that drives forth a killing machine.
Yeah, I describe it in the book as a system of suffering that the United States set up and employed in Vietnam. And this was something that was really driven home to me during my travels in Vietnam. It took me a long time to fully process this, what people went through on a day-to-day basis.
And that's an important point, that you went to Vietnam to interview victims, yeah.
Yeah, it was, it was some of the most rewarding reporting that I've ever done. And people were so giving of themselves, ready to revisit the most horrific days of their lives, the most horrible things imaginable. And I would lead them through the sequence of events again and again to make sure I got it right. I'm sure it was a traumatizing experience, but these people, they were willing to walk a very hard road with me to help me to understand exactly what the war meant to average people in that country.
And that's what we're waiting for in the wars in the Middle East. It won't come anytime soon.
Yeah, I'm afraid that like this book, it might take 30 or 40 years. There might be a historian or a reporter who finally is able to find secret records that might get buried away and put the entire story together.
Oh, when you speak the truth about war, you challenge that mythic narrative, which of course I attempted to do in my first book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And there is deep, deep resistance, not only among officialdom, because to do what you did, to expose the reality of the dark heart of imperialism in America, forces us to question ourselves. Are we as virtuous as we think we are? And of course, one walks away understanding that we're not. That we can become very easily acculturated to atrocity, like anyone else.
I think this is, it's very hard for Americans to grasp this or come to terms with it. And I think in many ways, this country never has.
Yeah.
I think Vietnam is still sort of a hidden or even a forbidden history that this country needs to grapple with. And then, of course, all that's come after.
We need to grapple with what we're doing at this moment in the Middle East. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
That was investigative journalist Nick Turse, author of Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam. Soldiers and Marines in Iraq and Afghanistan, as in Vietnam, have become socialized to atrocity. The killing project is not described in these terms to a distant public. The campaign to rid the world of terrorists is sold to us by politicians and generals as a crusade to rid the world of evil itself. But the distance between the reality and the myth is seismic. Combat veterans, when they return home, are often alienated from the world around them, a world that still believes in the myth of war and the virtues of the nation. There is an existential crisis of faith. The myths, national and religious, fed to us by schools, churches, Hollywood, the government, and the press are lies. And the sooner we expose these lies, the sooner will we be able to disengage from the longest and perhaps most disastrous war in American history. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. See you next week.